which is, by the way, the thinnest skin you have in your body, we have muscle. You can see this muscle here is in cross section. So it's actually running in the opposite direction. It's running more of a circular effect, which we're going to see in a minute. And that's known as the orbicularis. Another muscle comes down and fans out right in this area here. And when it retracts, it raises the upper lid. Off the diagram is another muscle. This one's called the levator. The one that's not on the diagram is referred to as Mueller's muscle. And that's what's used to raise the lid. And then finally, muscle-wise, there is a modified area of the muscle right here known as the muscle areolin. What that does is it helps keep the lid margin tightly against the eye. Remembering that the lids work like a squeegee to uniformly distribute your tear film. And so if they're not tight to the eye, you don't get a very good spreading of the tears. All right, here's a close-up look at those muscles that raise the upper lid. A little more anterior is the levator. The levator goes a little bit deeper toward the lid margin. Right behind it, up a little higher, is the muscle of Mueller. And some patients, due to stroke, injury, or whatever, will get damage to Mueller's muscle. And even though the levator is a strong muscle, it really relies on Mueller to assist it in raising the lid. So if you get a problem physically to Mueller's or neurologically where it's not innervated, then all of a sudden Mueller's not doing its job, and the end result is that the upper lid is going to start to droop. And I'm sure you've probably seen patients, many of them probably elderly, come in where one lid margin is clearly below the other eye. And that drooping of the lid margin is what's known as ptosis. And so if we look here, you see in this woman's left eye, she has a pretty large palpebral fissure. Really tried to help everybody out with the picture by making it larger. With her right eye, she was unable to move it at all, and you can see that a palpebral fissure like this in the right eye is not going to allow any light in through the pupil. So effectively, she's blind in that eye until we can get the upper lid moved up to allow the light to come in. Directly behind the muscles, you know, the yellow is fat, and you see we got some fat spread throughout. Directly behind the muscles is highlighted in a bluish gray here, is a fibrous material called the tarsus or tarsal plate. And this is what gives the shape and rigidity to the lid. You don't want just a piece of floppy skin covering your eye. You want some form and shape to it. And that's what you get from the tarsal plates. Where it comes into play with contact lenses is that sometimes we need to look at the inside lining of the lid or the palpebral conjunctiva. And so that requires flipping the lid. And to flip the lid, it doesn't bend anywhere within the tarsus. So if we're going to bend the lid, we're going to wind up having to put a Q-tip right about here, and then grab the lashes, pull out a little bit and up, and that lid will flip, exposing that inside lining of the lid, the conjunctiva, so we can see if it's being changed at all through contact lens wear. And then again, finally, on the inside, we have the conjunctiva. All right. Okay, so as we look at this, now we see a frontal view of the eye, and we can see right about here is where you would have a fold in your eyelid. You know, right up here is about where your eyebrow would be. And all of these lines represent the fibers of the orbicularis muscle. And you can see they really form what we'd refer to as a sphincter muscle. When it contracts, the opening gets smaller, that opening being the palpebral fissure. We can further subdivide the orbicularis into two zones. The palpebral, which would be the floppy part of the lid here. And remember, anytime you hear that word palpebral, we know it's referring to the lids in some fashion. You know, beyond that fold that you would get as you look closer into the orbit, this portion here that goes up toward your brow, this is known as the orbital portion of the orbicularis. Now, with a forced closure, those portions work together to give you a very tight closure of the lids. Just for normal blinking, it's typically just the palpebral portion that's blinking. One of the things that you'll find when you attempt to insert contact lenses is that some patients have interesting responses. You know, we essentially spend our life trying to keep things out of our eyes, and now we're trying to learn to put something in. And for some people, just the thought of something being put in their eye gives them a little panic attack, and they go into what we would refer to as a blepharospasm, where that muscle really tightens down. And if you attempt to insert the lens when they're in this little blepharospasm, good luck. Probably not going to happen. The best way, and I'll show you this this weekend, is to securely grip the lids so you can position them, but have a feel for is the patient relaxed or have the muscles tightened up. And with proper instruction, the patient will relax and you'll be able to open the lids and place the lens on the eye. But don't try and overcome the power of the orbicularis if they have gone into this spasm. We've also got some glands that are pretty important that are located within the lids. We've got some glands that lubricate our eyelashes. And our eyelashes are lubricated by both sweat and oil glands. Zeiss is the oil gland, my drawing's a little bit off, and sweat are the glands of mole, which you find right around here. The other glands that we have are the ones that produce the oily portion of your tear film, which is the meibomian glands. And these are these elongated sebaceous glands. You can see the green arrow right here. And that gland goes all the way down to the lid margin. Instead of lubricating a lash, it simply has an opening on the lid margin. In a healthy eye, you have a nice clear oil that comes down and empties out into your tears. We'll talk more about that in a minute. All right, so here's another cross-sectional view, giving you a nice close-up of the hair follicle, your eyelash, and the glands of mole and Zeiss that lubricate it. Then shifting toward the back part of the lid, we can see the meibomian gland and the opening on the lid margin. And sometimes you will get a blockage in those glands that lubricate the lashes, commonly known as a sty. The more correct term for it is hordeolum. You can also get a blockage in the meibomian glands that will give you a larger elevated area called a chalazion. And we'll talk more about this in a little while when we get into the conditions. I mentioned before that sometimes we need to take a look at that inside lining, that palpebral conjunctiva. And with a healthy lid, we put a Q-tip above the tarsus, grab the lashes, and we can flip it, and this is what we see. So we're actually looking at the inside lining of the upper lid. Now, right on the lid margin, all of these little holes, and you see we've got them both upper and lower, those are openings for the meibomian glands. And again, in a healthy eye, a little visual pressure, you'll see a nice clear oil coming out of those. We will look at a condition of meibomian gland dysfunction where you get sort of a cheesy looking material coming out of there. Not pretty. Now, you notice this, we're seeing a sort of a pinkish yellow color to the inside lining of the lid, and it's pretty smooth. These lines that you see in the drawing are the meibomian glands because the conjunctiva is relatively transparent, and you can literally look through it and see the underlying meibomian glands with a healthy eye. So collectively, what do the lids do for us? Well, they certainly block light during sleep. Primary function is to protect the eye, and pretty quick reaction to anything that's coming toward the eye. With a few blinks, we pretty efficiently remove any foreign particles that get in the eye. And the tear film component that comes from the lids would be what? That would be the oil. And collectively, with all the ingredients, as I mentioned before, the lid works like a squeegee to distribute the tear film over the cornea. Okay, now let's take a look at the conjunctiva. The conjunctiva is continuous from the lid margin all the way to the limbus next to the cornea. For the purposes of discussion, though, we always divide it into three areas. Again, anything that has to do with the lids, you're going to hear the term palpebral. So when we're talking palpebral, we're talking about that portion that lines the inside of the lids. The bulbar is the portion of the conjunctiva that covers the front part of the white part of your eye, or the sclera. And in between, there are loose folds of conjunctival tissue known as the fornix or cul-de-sac. Here's a cross-sectional view, and I've highlighted in green that inside lining of the lids, which would be the palpebral conjunctiva. In red, the part that's covering the sclera or the bulbar conjunctiva. And then you can see this cul-de-sac or fornix, sometimes called the conjunctival sac, both in the upper and lower lid. And again, it's continuous. The beauty of this is that no contact lens can go any further than the fornix or conjunctival sac. You know, and some patients are very concerned that that contact lens, if it gets loose in there, is going to go right back probably to the brain. Not the case. Can't go any further than either the upper conjunctival sac or the lower conjunctival sac. Now, that being said, it's not uncommon for lost lenses to get stuck up here. And there have been multiple cases where people had multiple lenses up in this upper conjunctival sac. You've got very few nerve endings up there, and so unless the patient takes the time to push their lid up, or the eye care professional push the lid up and take a look, the lost lens may actually just be hiding up here. You know, and that's why it's important anytime a contact lens patient comes in for a follow-up visit, you know, and they say, well, I lost my lenses, is that, you know, you take the time to take a look to make sure that the lens isn't stuck up there. Okay, so again, everted lid, this picture, you can get a nice clear view of what the openings should look like. Palpebral, bulbar, and the conjunctival sac in between. Now, one of the things that I skipped over was that there's two layers to the conjunctiva. The outer layer, the conjunctiva, which is the layer that's directly against the cornea and the conjunctiva, the cornea, is the epithelium. And housed within the epithelium are the goblet cells. Now, the conjunctiva is a mucous membrane. So for normal activity, it's secreting mucus that makes up part of your tear film. It also reduces friction. We'll talk about that more in a minute. The deeper layer of the conjunctiva is known as the Substantia Propria, or simply called the Stroma. So 2 layers in the conjunctiva, and we'll see how they start to merge into the 5 layers of the cornea. So collectively, the conjunctiva also protects the eye. In particular, it prevents foreign bodies from entering the orbit. Again, they can't go any higher than that upper conjunctival sac or that lower conjunctival sac. An important tear film component is the mucus, which we'll see it's the mucus that makes the surface of the cornea wettable. Otherwise, your tears would just bead up and run off. And a key thing is that we need that mucus to reduce friction. Does anybody know how often most people blink? And you can type your answer in the text box there if you want. We'll just see what people think. So how many seconds between blinks? Okay, did everybody find where you can type in your messages?
In the chat box. Anybody, there's questions.
The question is how many seconds are there typically between blinks for the average patient? So we're looking for a number. How many seconds?
We got one that said 15 per minute from Carmine.
Okay, well that's not a bad answer because the answer is actually once every 6 seconds. So so that works. And one of the things that we'll look at as part of our pre-fitting evaluation is what is the blink rate for that patient? What does their blink look like? Is it a full complete blink? Is it sort of a half blink? All of those things can impact on their ability to successfully wear contact lenses. And one of the things that we want to look at particularly at a follow-up visit is, has that blink rate been altered by the fact that they are wearing a contact lens? Some patients will have a rapid increase in blink rate. It's their body's reaction trying to blink out this foreign body. Other people will have a very restricted blink rate. We see this more with gas perm patients, where they start to figure out that, about the only time I feel the lens is when I blink. So if I don't blink, I don't feel the lens, it feels better, which is really not what we want them to do. But nevertheless, if we take a baseline reading and we notice during pre-fit what their blink rate looks like, what their blinking style looks like, then we can be alert to changes that may have occurred through their lens wear when they come back for follow-up visits. All right, so the bulbar conjunctiva covers the underlying sclera, the white part of the eye. And normally, the blood vessels are pretty small. This one here, you can see they're a little bit more dilated than on some eyes. Here's the limbal area. And you notice in the black circle up here, even though there's a few blood vessels, it looks pretty white. But if you look down below at that red triangle, you'll notice that it looks a little elevated in that area. It's risen up toward you a bit. And you can see that it's discolored. It now has more of a yellowish appearance. And that's a change that we would want to note in the conjunctiva on pre-fit as well as on subsequent visits. And what we're seeing is something that you probably see every day because we live in Florida. and that's the degeneration of the bulbar conjunctiva in response to excessive exposure to ultraviolet light. And in the conditions, we'll talk about this, and this is simply known as a pinguecula. And over a period of time, it will get a little more elevated, a little bit more discolored. And sometimes a contact lens, if you think the green line is the edge of a soft lens, for example, depending how the lens is fitting, it could cause some irritation to that area. So that's something, and it may affect the fit of the lens depending on how elevated it is. So that's something that we would pay attention to. Now this, on the other hand, you can see that there's a lot of blood vessels, and you can see that this whole mass has crossed over the limbus. Pingueculas will never cross over the limbus. This is an example of a pterygium, and you can see the pterygium vascularized, has a leading edge that's capable of growing across the cornea if left unchecked. And you've probably had patients with pterygiums as well. And left unchecked, it progresses slowly, but it will progress. And that's something that needs to be removed at some point. Unfortunately, they can grow back. From a contact lens perspective, I know some people that might consider fitting somebody after the pterygium was removed. But because of the fact that they can grow back, I would screen them out. I would not fit somebody that has a current or previous pterygium. Okay, let's take a look at the plumbing system of the eye now a little bit. And we talked about glands in the lid. Now we're going to talk about some glands where the watery part of your tears come from. And as we look at this person, these blue glands right here, this is known as the main lacrimal gland. And it actually rests in a depression or fossa in the orbital roof. And that fossa allows the gland to fit up there without interfering with the movement of the eye. And out of that comes lacrimal fluid, the watery part of your tears. Generally, this gland's not doing a whole lot. That gland sits up there and responds to certain stimuli. The stimuli that will get that to kick in, certainly foreign body in the eye, will cause a sudden downpour of lacrimal fluid from the main lacrimal gland. Emotional states, that's where that fluid's coming from. Bright lights can stimulate it. And even irritation to the nasal membranes can stimulate that. So if you had something that was offensive to the nasal membranes, like chopping onions, that could stimulate this main lacrimal gland. So this is referred to also as the reflex lacrimal gland, because it does typically just sit there unless it's responding to some of this stimuli. Now, we also have the worker bees, so to speak, the accessory lacrimal glands, also known as the glands of Krauss and Wolfring. These are also referred to as the basic secretors, because day in and day out, these are the glands that typically produce the watery part of your tears. I don't have a, oh yeah, here we go. All right, so here is the main lacrimal gland, get up in the roof on the temporal side. Here's my cross section that shows the glands of Krauss and Wolfring, and these are spread throughout the lids, and they secrete, again, the watery part of your tears on a day in and day out basis. In addition to secreting the lacrimal fluid, either from the main lacrimal gland due to reflex, or the basic secretors, Krause and Wolfram, just day in and day out, that material, that fluid, mixes with the oil from the meibomian glands and from the mucus from the conjunctiva to form your tear film. All right, you blink, again, about once every 6 seconds. As you blink, it spreads new tear fluid. The old tears are pushed toward the inner canthus, the nasal side of your eye. And the material flows into 2 little openings you have on your lid margins. Okay, we saw the little meibomian gland openings, but a significant larger opening is found nasally on the lower lid and the upper lid. And these are known as the punctum. In fact, you've probably had patients that suffered from dry eyes that got punctal plugs, where little silicone or collagen plugs are placed in those to basically stop up the drainage system, to try and maintain as much moisture as possible in the eye. But in the normal eye, you have an opening. The tears flow through that opening into a canal, or caniculi. One from the upper and lower, they merge, and they come over, and the tears collect in a lacrimal sac. From there, they drain down the nasolacrimal duct into your nose, which is why hearing your nose also runs. You know, it's all that extra fluid just overwhelms the system, but the fluid that's getting in the puncta is flowing into the nose. Some patients can get an infection in that sac called dacryocystitis, where it gets inflamed and you've got an infection in there, and it's pretty ugly. Very difficult to clean up. Sometimes in very small infants, it'll look like they're crying all the time. And part of it is that sometimes they have an underdeveloped drainage system. And the pediatrician will ask the parents to just massage that nasal area, and they're just trying to get that lacrimal sac and nasolacrimal duct working properly to drain the tears. It's not that they're, the kid's upset. Yeah, maybe they're upset, but it's more likely that they're just exceeding the drainage power of the system the way it is. So the pediatrician will have the parents massage that for a period of time, then all of a sudden, voila, the tears are flowing out properly. And here's a close-up of what that all looks like. And you do have a little valve down here that, this is designed to be a one-way system. The tears come in, they collect, they drain, they go into the nose. I'm sure you've all seen the YouTube videos where people have things squirting out into their eyes, squirting out of the punctum. There's one of somebody snorting a glass of milk, and the fluid comes out the puncta. Really bad idea. You're overwhelming and reversing this valve that's supposed to be a one-way deal. Plus, the chance of infection is significant. So, it might be a cool party trick, but really a bad idea. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at collectively what it does. Again, the watery part of your tears are coming out, and it's draining the junk out of your eye. So at this point, we have talked about the components of your precorneal film or tear film. We know the mucus comes from the goblet cells in the conjunctiva. We know the aqueous or lacrimal layer probably comes from the basic secretors, which would be Krause and Wolfram. Although depending on the response, you'll get some reflex lacrimal fluid coming from that main lacrimal gland. And you've got the lipid or oily film coming from the oil from the meibomian glands. So all this gets whipped together, and each layer has an important function. Now, all the way at the bottom of the screen, we see where it says epithelium. All right, that's the outermost layer of the cornea, which we'll get to in a little bit. And we can see that how irregular that surface is. What we can't see in the picture is that surface is also what we'd refer to as hydrophobic. If you were to sprinkle fluid on there, it would tend to want to bead up and run off. So one of the main functions of the mucin layer is to convert that relatively hydrophobic surface to a hydrophilic or water-loving surface. And so by having a foundation of mucus, it allows the aqueous layer to spread and adhere for a longer period of time to the cornea. Again, no mucus, you could have a bunch of lacrimal fluid getting pumped out, but it just beads up and runs off, really doesn't do what it needs to do. You can see clearly the aqueous layer is by far the thickest, and then the thin layer on the outside, the lipid or oily film layer from the meibomian glands. Now, precorneal film, many important functions. In fact, a great predictor as to how good of a contact lens patient you're going to have. Generally speaking, if you've got poor quality or quantity of tears, you're going to have a poor contact lens patient. It just really doesn't work well if you don't have sufficient tears. Now, if you're walking down the street, you got all sorts of dust and debris and, foreign bodies flying into your eye. It's amazing how well the tears and the lids work to get rid of those foreign bodies. Also, if we go back up to the previous slide, you can see how irregular the epithelium is. Remember, the cornea is the eye's principal refracting surface. So if we were to shine light on a surface that irregular, we would get a very poor quality image. So it's up to the tear film to fill in those irregularities and provide a smooth optical surface. So even though we call the cornea the principal refracting surface, the quality of what happens is really dependent on having a very stable tear film. Nutrition. I mentioned before the cornea is avascular. There's no blood supply. The cells need energy to stay alive, and we'll see how it takes the nutrients, the glucose that's in the tear film, and breaks it down to provide energy to the cornea to survive. Also contained within the tear film is an antibacterial agent called lysozyme. It's incredible if you culture somebody's tears just how many nasty microorganisms are present. And it's even worse if the lysozyme wasn't there to try and keep things in check. And then finally, being that the cornea is avascular, it relies on oxygen from external sources. And the number one external source is the atmosphere. But for that oxygen, that 21% oxygen that's in the atmosphere, to get to the cornea where it can do some good, it has to diffuse through the tear film. So the tear film is bringing that oxygen that's so important to the corneal layers. Because the quantity and quality of tears is so important to successful contact lens wear, it's important that we take the time to check the quantity and quality of tears that are present before we subject somebody to a contact lens fitting. In some cases, it's pretty obvious. In other cases, it requires a little more investigation. One test that can be done is the test that you see this gentleman being subjected to in the image, called the Schirmer test. And with the Schirmer test, and really for it to be effective, you should put a topical anesthetic in first. Because that's not an option for most opticians, this really isn't a very helpful test for us. But typically you'd put the topical anesthetic in, you would take this piece of filter paper, very much like a coffee filter, and with a little notch in it, you bend it, you stick it in the lower conjunctival sac, And the person sits just like they are in the image for 5 minutes. And at the end of 5 minutes, you measure how many millimeters of the strip are moistened. Now, if you do the test without the topical anesthetic, you can be pretty sure the whole strip's going to be dripping at the end of 5 minutes. Most people don't do well when you stick a piece of paper in their eye. So anyways, that's the Schirmer test, even though as optician contact lens fitters, it's not a test that we typically use. A far better test is what's known as the tear breakup test. And if we take fluorescein, which is a vegetable dye, and we instill it into the tears, it mixes readily, and under a cobalt light, it will take the yellowish orange fluid and turn it a fluorescent green. If you look at the upper right-hand slide, you can see it's a fairly uniform tear layer. You know, they just blinked and it's looking pretty good. Now, the other thing that fluorescein will do, it will stain areas where there's a break in the surface of the cornea. You know, as long as the corneal epithelium is intact, the fluorescein stays in the tears like you see in the upper left-hand corner. If there's a break in the surface, it will be absorbed and will stain those areas a bright green. You can see that a little bit in slide 2. If we come over second row down over to the right, you can see some bright green areas, which would again indicate corneal staining. For tear breakup, we're hoping we don't see any corneal staining. What we're looking for is they blink, we get a nice uniform green, and at some point the tear film starts to break up. And you can see in some of these slides these little dark areas, these little dark patches. I tried to highlight a couple with red here. From the time they blink until the time that first dark spot appears, that's your tear breakup time. Now, for the average patient, that should be about 12 to 15 seconds. So, you know, if you blink once every 6 seconds, you never really experience those dry spots on your cornea. You know, you blink before they really get to be a problem. If you get patients that have a very short tear breakup time, you know, then it can affect not only comfort-wise, but also visually with a very short tear breakup time. So hopefully we have patients that have breakups between 12 and 15 seconds, and we'll talk about how you would check that and how to do that with a slit lamp this weekend. If you have a tear film or a tear breakup time that's less than 10 seconds, then you clearly have a dry eye patient and probably do not want to fit them with contact lenses. Yeah, this is just showing a, you know, he's same guy had the Schirmer strips, but another way that you can check to see the volume of tears rather than subjecting them to this is with careful slit lamp observation. What I've drawn here, kind of poorly, but here's the cornea. Here's the lower bulbar conjunctiva. Here's the conjunctival sac. Here's the palpebral conjunctiva. Here's the lid margin. This squiggly little blue line here represents the level of lacrimal fluid filling this space between the palpebral conjunctiva and the bulbar conjunctiva. As you look at the lid margin with a slit lamp, you'll be able to see that space. And if you get a nice shiny reflection, you can see the tears are right up to where they should be, where they're pretty much even with the lid margin, then that's a pretty good lacrimal lake. If on closer inspection, you find that the fluid is very clear, there's not a lot of debris floating in the lake, that's another good sign that you have a good quantity and quality of tears. You know, if you see a lake that's not quite full, you see a lot of debris, not only here, but also in the tear film that covers the cornea, you know, chances are they're not going to have great quality tears, and all that debris that you see is just not getting flushed out. So consequently, if you put a contact lens in there, all that debris is going to wind up on the contact lens. A couple other tests that are used much less frequently. There's a Rose-Bengal test where you put a fluid in and it stains devitalized cells. Doesn't have to be a break in the cornea, just has to be devitalized or not healthy enough to keep the stain out. Rose-Bengal testing typically wouldn't be done unless you had a borderline breakup test. Okay, let's move on to the eyeball itself. We know that the outer protective layer of the eye consists of two parts. The white part of the eye, or the sclera, which is about 5/6, and the remaining 1/6, which protrudes out, has a steeper curvature, which would be the cornea. We have a middle vascular coat consisting of the iris, the ciliary body behind that, and then the choroid behind that. And finally, we have the inner nervous layer being the retina. So with the sclera, as we look at it, white part of the eye, we can see where it stops at the limbal area here. And if we look at it in cross section, we can see it runs from the limbus all the way around, 5/6 of the globe. The outer layers merging with the optic nerve. Doesn't really do a whole lot other than to protect the eye, but also to block light. Remember, the eye is operating a lot like a camera, and you want to make sure there's no light getting into the eye except through the pupil. So the sclera and its underlying heavily pigmented brown layer does a pretty good job of that. Curvature, radii curvature is important with contact lenses, and this just kind of gives you an idea of the effects of a longer radius giving you a flatter curve, a shorter radius giving you a steeper curve. In this case here, the shorter radius represents the cornea, and the longer radius represents the sclera. The only flaw in this diagram is it shows the cornea being spherical edge to edge, when in reality, we'll see that the cornea is more aspheric, where it's steeper in the center and gets flatter, almost assuming the radius of the sclera as you approach the limbus. So if we want to break it down into layers, we've got an Epithelium on the outside, just sort of a loose fibrous layer. The bulk of the sclera is stroma, which is just layer after layer of collagen fibers randomly wound to give the incredible strength. Very much like the windings that you'd see on a golf ball or a ball of yarn. Then finally, that heavily pigmented layer that prevents light penetrating the eye is known as the Lamina Fusca. So with the sclera, there's not a lot there other than things that pass through it. We got things going in, we got things going out. In the back of the sclera, we've got a sieve-like area called the lamina cribrosa. And it's through that area that the optic nerve fibers leave the eye and form the optic nerve. Also centrally, we've got the central retinal artery and vein. Surrounding the optic nerve, we have the long and short ciliary arteries and nerves penetrating the sclera. But again, they don't really linger very long in the sclera. They punch their way through and then spread out. We'll see that the blood brings the good stuff. The arteries, they get smaller and smaller. They provide the nutrition they need, and then the return vessels, the veins, get bigger and bigger until finally you have four main return vessels or veins that exit the eye. Are known as the venae vorticosi, or simply the vortex veins. You also have some that punch their way through up closer to the limbus, through the sclera. And then right near the limbus, you have a circular channel called the canal of Schlemm, which is where the aqueous and the anterior segment drains from the eye. All right, here's a little diagram, and you can see, we're looking at the back part of the sclera. We can see the optic nerve here. We can see the long and short ciliary arteries and veins punching their way through. We can see that we have 4 veni vorticosi or vortex veins, 1 in each quadrant. So that's what the back of your sclera would look like. As much as the sclera doesn't do much, the cornea does a whole bunch. And the cornea certainly is the #1 structure that we have to worry about when we're fitting contact lenses. Our goal is to keep the cornea just the same as it was prior to contact lens wear. And sometimes that's a challenge. Again, 1/6 of the globe should be transparent, is clearly the principal refracting medium of the eye. Some people initially think, well, the lens does a lot, but really out of the 59 diopters, that's the refractive power of the average eye, 43 of those 50 diopters comes from the cornea. Now, when we get into measuring corneas, we will see that the corneal power in diopters can range, 40 up to 46 and still be kind of normal. But 43 is the average. One of the things we'll also measure in our pre-fit is the diameter of the cornea. The typical cornea is about 11 to 12 millimeters in diameter. Because the cornea is clear and it's hard to tell precisely where it starts and stops, we typically take a horizontal visible iris diameter measurement instead of an actual corneal measurement. And that horizontal visible iris diameter, or HVID, also typically is somewhere between 11 and 12. Occasionally you'll find a 10.5, occasionally you'll find a 12.5, but the bulk are 11, 11.5, or 12. Thickness-wise, cornea is about a ½ millimeter thick in the center to about 1 millimeter thick at the edge. All right, here's a nice horizontal cut of the eye, and to kind of appreciate all the different structures. So again, we got the cornea sticking out here. We got all this is sclera. We've got the iris. We've got the ciliary body. We've got the choroid, and then finally we've got the retina in the back. The cornea is slightly oval in shape, so another reason why we use the horizontal visible iris diameter is we want to have the longest dimension when we're selecting a contact lens. We'll see when we get into soft lenses, rule of thumb is you get that HVID measurement, you add 2 millimeters, and that tells you the smallest soft lens that you should fit to somebody. Because the cornea is so important, we need to have a good understanding of the different layers of the cornea. Okay, so with the epithelium, that's the outermost layer of the cornea, and 5 to 6 cell layers thick. And you get a new epithelium about once a week. They start next to Bowman's layer as basal cells. The new basal cells push out the old basal cells, which become wing cells. The wing cells get progressively flatter, become squamous cells. They die and they get sloughed off into the tear film. So again, that process typically takes about a week. The good news is that if there's irritation to the cornea, if there's an injury to the cornea, as long as it doesn't go any deeper than the epithelium, it will regenerate and the problem will disappear and there'll be no permanent scarring. Anything that goes deeper than the epithelium, you're probably going to get some scarring. Now, here's a cross-section of the cornea. And we're looking from outside on the left, where this would be the tears. This very structured area that's a little darker to the left is your epithelium. Bowman's layer is pretty much impossible to see. This huge thick area that we have here is the stroma. You have Decime's membrane, which is difficult to see right here, and then the heavily pigmented cells that you see are darker cells of the innermost side is your endothelium. Here's a little bit easier diagram to look at. Gives you an idea of the proportions. Certainly the stroma is the thickest. It makes up about 90% of the cornea's thickness. Down here where we have Decime's membrane, in some of the very newest texts, and it hasn't quite made it into most textbooks yet, there is a new layer just above Decime's that's been found called Dua's layer. And it's just a modified area of the stroma. So, if you look at a textbook a couple years from now, it will show 6 layers instead of 5 layers for the cornea. Here's a nice blow-up of the epithelium, and it does a great job of showing you the shape of these new basal cells, sometimes called columnar basal cells. So they look like little columns. So they're resting on Bowman's layer, which is right here, which serves as sort of a basement membrane for those epithelial cells. So the new cells start here. You can see the wing cells are a little bit flattened. Basal cells, and then way out here the squamous cells are super flat and they're almost dead. Again, not a lot happening in Bowman's layer, but by the time you get to Bowman's, you can wind up with some permanent scarring. One of the things that adds to the cornea's transparency is that in the stroma, unlike the sclera where the collagen fibers were just randomly wrapped like windings on a golf ball, there's a very regular arrangement to the collagen fibers. Each layer alternates at right angles, much like if you were stacking wood. And as you look at it, you can see the whole cornea in a healthy eye has a very regular arrangement to it. Decime's membrane close to the endothelium, very resistant to infection. So if you were to get a corneal infection, Decime's serves as kind of a final line of defense to avoid perforation. Then finally we get to the endothelium. Now, and unlike the epithelium where you get a new epithelium once a week, with the endothelium, it's a single layer of hexagonal cells, and if you lose them, the other ones try and cover the defect, but you're not creating new endothelial cells. And that can present a problem. We'll see that with some of the conditions that we'll look at a little bit later on. So with this view right here, you're actually standing in the anterior chamber looking out, and this is how those hexagonal shaped endothelial cells would appear to you. In a healthy eye, each one of them is very regular in size and shape. With the power of the more powerful microscopes that we have today, you can take a look at the pattern of the endothelial cells in the living eye. And if we look at this one, it looks pretty darn even. There's not a lot of variance in the size and shape of these cells. However, what we have found over the years is that a long-term lack of oxygen to the cornea can create changes in these endothelial cells, both in size and in shape. So if we look at this one here, you can see kind of a weird looking pattern. They're different sizes, they're different shapes. The different size is called polymegathism. The different shape is called pleomorphism. But that's a direct result of a chronic long-term hypoxia or lack of oxygen caused by contact lens wear. Now, being that the cornea is avascular, all its nourishment must come from other sources. So we've got the limbal vessels, we've got the aqueous humor that fills the anterior chamber, and we got the tears. Those are your three sources. How the cells get their energy to survive is through the breakdown of the glucose that they can get from those three sources. Now, so really we've got what's in the tears, we got what's in the aqueous humor in the anterior chamber, and we got what diffuses through the limbal vessels. Those are your three sources. This is, for those that have had biology courses, forgive me, this is kind of a simplification, but this is sufficient for what we're doing here. Basically, there's two ways to break down the glucose to release the energy. One is without oxygen, which is known as anaerobic glycolysis. And that breakdown without the oxygen present produces only 2 molecules of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, for each molecule of glucose. And the waste product that occurs is called lactic acid, which the body has a difficult time getting rid of. What we hope happens is that we provide enough oxygen to the cornea that we're operating under aerobic glycolysis. And now, for each molecule of glucose, we get 36 units of energy, or ATP. And the waste product that's created is carbon dioxide and water, which the cornea can get rid of fairly easily. So to keep the cornea healthy, keep it out of that sort of survival mode that it goes into with the anaerobic glycolysis, we want to make sure we get enough oxygen to the eye. Oxygen can come from the tear film, from the limbal vessels, from the aqueous, and even from the palpebral-conjunctival vessels when your eye is closed. But it's critical that we have enough oxygen if we want to keep the cornea healthy. And unfortunately, when we place a contact lens on the eye, we're putting a barrier between the #1 source of oxygen and the cornea. So to keep the cornea clear, a few things have to happen. We need to keep the blood vessels out of the cornea. We'll look at some cases where blood vessels have invaded, neovascularization, a little bit later on. That very regular arrangement of those collagen fibers. Collagen's collagen. So, why is the sclera white and the cornea clear? Well, a lot of it is the very regular arrangement of those collagen fibers, and the fact that they're not allowed to fully hydrate. That collagen is kept in a relatively dehydrated state. Doesn't mean it's dry, it just means it would absorb more moisture given the opportunity, kind of like a sponge. What keeps the cornea in that relatively dehydrated state is an intact and fully functioning epithelium and endothelium. Those are the gatekeepers. Those are the two layers that control the movement of fluids and gases in and out of the cornea. As long as your epithelium and your endothelium are working, it will very carefully regulate the level of hydration of those collagen fibers, which therefore will allow it to remain clear. All right, and here's kind of a drawing, shows some things that happen with the cornea. You've got a mixture of fluids here. You got fluid in the tear, you got fluid in the cornea, you got fluid in the anterior chamber or the aqueous humor. That fluid is basically salt water. It's got a certain salt concentration to it. And based on the salt concentration, that's kind of what drives the direction that the fluid goes. Now, the fluid in the body is typically 0.9% salt or sodium chloride. So if you've got 3 areas of fluid, tears, cornea, aqueous humor, and the anterior chamber, both the epithelium in the front and endothelium in the back are known as semi-permeable membranes, meaning that they will control the movement of fluids and gases in and out. If you have a higher concentration of salt in one of these three areas, then the fluid is going to move toward the higher salt concentration to try and balance things out. And that's what's used to help the cornea, keep the cornea in that relatively dehydrated state. Okay. So if all three areas of fluid were that same 0.9%, if we introduce a fluid to the body that's 0.9%, it's referred to as isotonic. All right, it's got the same salt concentration. In fact, most contact lens solutions that are designed to go in the eye will start out with some statement to the effect that it's a sterile, hopefully, isotonic solution, meaning that it's going to have that same 0.9% there. Now, what happens with the tear film is you blink, and over a period of time, the water starts to evaporate. That aqueous fluid, the lacrimal fluid, the watery part of your tear starts to evaporate through the atmosphere. And as that does, it leaves a higher salt concentration. So the instant you blink, you're probably isotonic, but very quickly thereafter, the tear film shifts from being isotonic to being hypertonic, having a higher salt concentration. So therefore, that's going to tend to absorb excess fluid out of the cornea, and that happens naturally. On the back side, it's a little more difficult because you got the corneal fluid at 0.9%, you got the aqueous humor at 0.9%. So we need a little help on the back side, and that's a unique property of the endothelium. That single layer of hexagonal cells has the ability to expel sodium ions, or basically push the salt out into the aqueous humor in the anterior chamber, which in turn pulls out excess fluid. So the pushing of the salt and the pulling of the fluid is known as a sodium pump, and that's what happens inside the endothelium. Now, some things can mess up the transparency just because of the not having the right balance. One obvious situation would be if you ever go swimming with your eyes open, and as soon as you get out of the pool or the lake or whatever, you look around, everything's a little blurry because you've been bathing the eye in a hypotonic solution, something that has a salt concentration less than 0.9%. And so now the fluid is reversing, and instead of being drawn from the cornea, it's being absorbed into the cornea. You know, and that rainbow that you see around lights and things when you just get out of the pool, you know, that's an example of corneal swelling, or what we would consider edema. And that's the very same experience that a contact lens patient will have if they're not getting enough oxygen, if they're not able to control the fluid balance inside the cornea. One of the things we will look for during follow-up visits are signs of corneal swelling or edema. Now, here's some classic pictures here. This was probably caused by a gas perm patient or an old, even older material patient, contact lens wearer. Look at the upper slide. You can see the pupils nice and black and clear. But look at number one. We got a little bit of haze here, and even more prominent in number two here. All right, that's corneal swelling. That's edema. And you can see how that swelling, due to a lack of oxygen, will create a loss of transparency. And look at 3 and 4, you can see it's even more pronounced. Now, the other bad thing that happens when you don't get enough oxygen is you can stimulate vessel growth. You know, the cornea wants to survive. If you're not providing it in a traditional fashion, those blood vessels are going to bring in what's needed. And if you look here, you know, here's where the limbus is, and look at how far those vessels have penetrated into the cornea. Now, at this point, you know, they should never wear a contact lens. And you will actually see patients in this situation. Because unfortunately, neovascularization, there's no sensation or pain connected to it. unless they're observant, they may not see the fact that those blood vessels are growing in. Now, this takes a while. So clearly, this would be someone that did not return for follow-up visits, which unfortunately does happen. And here's a really severe case here. You can see how far those blood vessels have penetrated. Okay, I know that's a lot, but hopefully it was all just review for everybody. But at least it makes sure that everybody is on the same page. So at this point, why don't we take just a couple minutes and just stand up, stretch, do whatever, and we will reconvene in about 3 minutes. Why don't you just type OK in the text box so I know you're still alive out there. Mark, I'm not seeing the chat box for the participants.
We can get started anytime.
Okay, so after our review of anatomy of the eye, now it'll make a little more sense, hopefully, as we talk about some of the ocular conditions that may impact someone's ability to wear a contact lens. And what we'll do is we'll break it down based on where the condition is located. And I'll try and identify each condition as belonging into one of 3 categories. The first category is where, by having this condition, it would be referred to as a contraindication to contact lens wear. As long as this condition was present or active, they should not be fit with a contact lens. In some cases, we will find that because of the condition, they would clearly benefit from wearing a contact lens. In some cases, it's to protect the eye, to relieve sensation, provide the best vision, variety of reasons. But in those categories, it would be an indication for contact lens wear. And then the third category will be what we would refer to as unremarkable. You look at it, the eye looks weird, but the condition has no impact on somebody's ability to wear a contact lens. All right, so let's start with the lids. And one of the more common conditions that you'll see with the lids is blepharitis. And you've probably seen this across the dispensing table many times. And it basically just looks like dandruff of the eyelashes. And the patient can get this under control with some effort. Sometimes they'll just use baby shampoo and a Q-tip to scrub off the dandruff. There are commercially prepared lid scrubs that can be used to help. Occasionally, you can wind up with an infection and it becomes an ulcerative blepharitis. And in this case, the eyes get much redder, you may even start to bleed, and clearly you would not fit them with contact lenses. So here's sort of your standard blepharitis. And again, most of the crusting you'll see right at the base of the lashes. Although sometimes you can get some pretty sizable chunks hanging on the lashes. Now, for somebody wearing glasses, it doesn't look great, but it's not a big deal. For contact lens wearers, it is a big deal because if those little flakes come off, get in the tear film, and get trapped underneath the contact lens, they could cause some significant corneal irritation. Again, here's an ulcerative one, and I'm pretty sure most people wouldn't want to put a contact lens in their eye if their eye looked like that. Chalazions. You'll recall when we were talking about the glands that are housed within the lid, we talked about the meibomian glands. Those glands that should be providing a nice clear oil that makes up part of the tears. However, sometimes you can get a blockage in those elongated glands. The plumbing gets plugged up, and you start to get some swelling. And you can notice on this slide here the large lump that's forming on the lower lid. Sometimes with warm washcloths and things that may release. Other times it may need to be surgically opened up. One that's sometimes confused with the chalazion is the hordeolum or sty. And unlike the chalazion, which is really just a blockage, this is an infection of the sebaceous glands, oil glands, and usually the ones that lubricate the eyelashes. And if you look at the slide here, you can see it looks very much like a pimple. And it sort of progresses like that. So it'll eventually come to a head and probably discharge. Again, warm washcloths can help. What's not a great idea is to attempt to pop it, because that may spread the infection to all the surrounding glands. Now here's one that you typically see more in elderly patients, where their lower lid droops. It's called ectropion, and this person would clearly not make a good contact lens patient. Interestingly enough, the reverse of that, called entropion, where the lid curls inward toward the eye, is one of the clear indications for a contact lens. You can all appreciate what it's like to get a one eyelash in your eye. Can you imagine all of your eyelashes in your eye? Very, very uncomfortable. So one of the things that will bring these people instant relief is fitting them with a therapeutic contact lens, typically just a non-prescription or prescription soft lens that's placed on there to provide a barrier between the eye and the lashes. Here's another case here. If you look carefully on the left eye, you will see the lashes laying directly on the cornea. Here's a close-up. And you can imagine just how uncomfortable that would be. And so in this case here, what they need to do is they need to roll that lid margin back out and, and surgically correct that, which would look something like this. Now, trichiasis is a little different with the same end result as entropion. In this case here, most of the lashes are okay, but you got some lashes that instead of curling out, decide that they want to curl back in and start to impinge on the eyeball. So again, you need to protect the eye from those lashes, and the quickest way to do it is to place a therapeutic soft lens on that patient's eye. They can be surgically removed. Some people just pluck them. Conjunctival cyst, you will see, and most of the time it's not a big deal. They can appear on the bulbar, the palpebral, or even the conjunctival sac. And it's usually caused by a blockage in one of the accessory lacrimal glands. Now in this case here, you can see it's filled with a clear fluid. It's a long ways away from the limbus, so if you were wearing a soft lens, there's no way this would have any impact on your ability to wear the lens. And this will probably resolve on its own after a period of time. Oops, let me go back here for a second. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about in follow-up care, probably on Sunday, is that if you see something like this, but it's not on the bulbar, it's on the palpebral, lower palpebral conjunctiva, it may be caused by chronic irritation, meaning that the edge of the lens is irritating that area, which would cause us to want to investigate a little more closely if we saw some of these conjunctival cysts on the lower palpebral conjunctiva. Nevus, or nevi, if you have more than one, are the scary definition is benign epithelial tumors, but in reality they're usually just like a freckle or a mole, just an excessive collection of pigment. However, it is worth noting on the patient's record. And usually if you ask me to say, hey, you always had that little brown spot on your eye, they'll go, oh yeah, yep, it's always been there. So you note the size and location and move on. Not a big deal. Where it could be a big deal is if all of a sudden it appeared, or if it's changing in size or color or shape. There is a small possibility that it could be a melanoma, and that's not certainly something that you'd wish on any patient. Okay, the next one is a subconjunctival hemorrhage. This is the one that gets the patients really excited. The bulbar conjunctiva is very loosely attached to the underlying sclera. You can actually take your lid margin and press on the bulbar conjunctiva and move the conjunctiva up and down. That's actually one of the ways you can sometimes figure out if the blood vessel you're looking at is a conjunctival vessel or an underlying scleral vessel. The conjunctival vessels you can move around. Occasionally, one of those blood vessels will rupture. And unlike scratching your arm or something where the blood drains out, you wipe it off, put a Band-Aid on it, and it's good. In this case, the blood is trapped between the conjunctiva and the sclera. So sometimes just a really small vessel leaking can create a significant area covered with blood. That's a good shot here. Most patients, they wake up in the morning and they see that, that's going to get their attention. And most of the time, it's typically not a big deal. You know, they may have sneezed too hard, they may have rubbed their eye too hard, you know, rolled over their hand when they were sleeping. It's usually not a big deal. Certainly one question would be to ask the patient, do you recall anything flying into your eye? Because if it was caused by a penetrating foreign body, then that's a huge deal and they need to go see the ophthalmologist right away. But most of the time, it's not a big deal. And some patients may have recurring subconjunctival hemorrhages. If that's the case, they may want to get their blood pressure checked. Now, this one here is pretty new. You can see it's a nice bright red. It takes a while for these to reabsorb. They're probably going to go a couple weeks before this disappears. It'll go from this to sort of a yellowish brown color, and then slowly will fade away. But you know, as long as it's not caused by a penetrating foreign body, it's not a big deal. All right, pingueculas. We looked at one earlier at the very beginning tonight. It's a yellowish triangular thickening of the bulbar conjunctiva, usually located at either 3 or 9 o'clock, caused by excessive exposure to ultraviolet light. And it's a cumulative thing. You know, back when I was up in New England, I would see this in people that were in their 60s, 70s, that had lived outside, worked construction, worked on the fishing boats. Those are the people that got it. Down here, a lot of the students in their 20s are already showing signs of pingueculas. If their parents had been diligent in making them wear sunglasses or even a hat from an early age, chances are they wouldn't have that pinguecula now. From a contact lens standpoint, we'll look at this one right here. Again, notice how white the top part is here above the triangle, and you can see how you also got some elevation here. So no hard and fast on a pinguecula. If it doesn't appear to affect the fit of the lens, if during follow-up you don't see any irritation because of the lens, then it's probably not a problem. Yeah, it's not great looking, but it's really not doing any real damage to the eye per se. There's no threat to their sight based on having a pinguecula. It can be removed, but it's a cosmetic procedure, so the patient's going to have to pay for it. Now pterygiums, you know, totally different deal. Now you've got a growing membrane capable of growing across the cornea and becoming sight-threatening. Same causes. In fact, many times when you look at a pterygium, you will see an underlying pinguecula. They can be removed, however, they can also grow back. And there's one here, and you can see the heavy vascularization going to this leading edge of the pterygium. You know, unfortunately, as it grows deep enough. It's not just sitting on the epithelium, that when it's removed, there is some permanent scarring as well. You know, here's one that's pretty pronounced as well. The only good news about them is they do grow very slow, so it shouldn't be a huge surprise to someone. They've seen it for a while. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about conjunctivitis. Certainly that's something that, you know, probably a lot of you have either had a friend, a child, or personally experienced a bacterial conjunctivitis known as pink eye. You know, this is pretty contagious. It spreads rapidly. If you get an elementary school, it'll spread like wildfire. Remember, if we're talking conjunctivitis, we're talking about irritation or inflammation of the conjunctiva. If it is bacterial, usually you'll get a significant discharge. You'll see mucus. The patient will wake up, they may not even be able to open their eyelids. They'll be matted shut due to the mucus. Viral conjunctivitis, you know, happens as well. One of the ways you can kind of differentiate between that and the bacterial is that with the viral, it tends to be a much more watery discharge. There's also an allergic type conjunctivitis. Some people with seasonal allergies will develop this, where you get these bumps forming on the palpebral conjunctiva. There's also an allergic type that reacts to usually protein deposits on a soft contact lens. And fortunately, with frequent replacement lenses, we don't see this nearly as much anymore. But the only way to see this is to flip the lid. And this is a fairly advanced stage of giant papillary conjunctivitis that we're looking at on this slide. For a patient like this, they should really, well, they need to stop wearing their contact lens. By not wearing the lens, that will help. Some doctors will treat it with steroids as well. If you want to get a little better look at the bumps, if you put fluorescein, that vegetable dye that we talked about for tear breakup times, that will highlight the papillae. And in advanced stages, we'll even show staining at the apex of the papillae. Another condition is keratitis sicca, or keratoconjunctivitis sicca, also known as a dry eye. And we talked earlier about the three sources of components of your tears: the mucus from the goblet cells in the conjunctiva, the lacrimal fluid from the accessory lacrimal glands, or Krause and Wolfring, and the outer lipid layer from the meibomian glands. It could be any of those three that are causing the dry eye. You don't have the mucus, the lacrimal fluid beads up and runs off. You don't have enough lacrimal fluid, you don't have the flushing action that you need. And if you don't have enough oil on the outside, it evaporates too quickly. So those tests that we talked about earlier would be important in checking out someone with keratitis sicca. Again, generally, dry eye patients are not good contact lens patients. I'd mentioned rose Bengal as another test. If we look at this eye, you can see all the pink area at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And that's not blood. That's actually the rose Bengal staining the devitalized conjunctiva in that area, a clear sign that they have a very dry eye. Here's the tear breakup time that we talked about earlier. Again, we put the fluorescein in, mixes with the tears, they blink, and we watch from when you get a nice uniform like this until the first dark spot appears, and that's your tear breakup time, and we're hopefully getting 12 to 15 seconds for a good patient. All right, now here's another one in the cornea. And this is really the first one that we've come to that I would classify as unremarkable. You look at it and you get this weird bluish white ring running around their cornea. Notice that there's about 1 millimeter of clear cornea from the limbus, and then you start to see this collection, this white ring. And it's basically fat deposits in there, typically seen in older patients. Known as arcus senilis. Occasionally you may see in a younger person where it's known as juvenile arcus. And in somebody like that, they may want to get their cholesterol levels checked. Now this person's older patient, and you can see they've got a double issue here. They've got the arcus, which is pretty clear to see, which would not be a problem. However, they also have a pterygium. You can see the growth going past the limbus, which would be a contraindication to contact lens wear. One of the conditions that you'll hear a lot about in contact lenses is keratoconus. And one of the main reasons is that even though it makes up a relatively small percentage of the general population, because contact lenses are essential to the management of keratoconus. People particularly that are involved in specialty contact lens practice will see a significant number of keratoconus patients. Very interesting condition. Normal eye, you can see on the left there, you recall that the average curvature was about 43 diopters. With keratoconus, as it advances, can exceed 60 diopters. And what's unusual is that, if you think of the cornea bulging forward, you might think of that the cornea is swelling. But with keratoconus, as it bulges forward, it becomes progressively thinner. And as it becomes thinner and more steep, you get an increase in myopia and you get an increase in astigmatism, but unfortunately the astigmatism is irregular. So consequently, the flattest and steepest curves are not 90 degrees apart, and glasses become worthless as it advances. About the only way to properly maintain or to preserve their vision is to use a rigid contact lens to fill in those irregularities. And for many years, that's been a specially designed corneal contact lens for keratoconus, and we'll talk a little bit about that on Sunday. Today, though, there's starting to be more of a shift to utilizing scleral lenses to manage advanced keratoconus, and we'll talk about those as well. And the reason that the patient may be motivated for contact lenses is because it's really the only alternative to a corneal transplant. And even though corneal transplants are pretty successful, it's the most successful transplant surgery out there. There's still a lot of risk involved with it, and sometimes the results are less than optimal. Okay, and here's a patient. You can see on the left-hand side how that cornea is bulging forward. One of the ways that keratoconus can be diagnosed, although it's a bit crude, is through something called Munson's sign. If we look at the image on the right, we'll notice that the patient's right eye, if we look at the lower lid margin, it's a pretty uniform flattening from center to edge. But if we look at his left eye, you can see how the lower lid margin is deformed. It's actually pointing out toward the center. And that deformation of the lower lid is known as Munson's sign, and that can be another indication that the patient has keratoconus. Although we will look at a number of ways to figure that out without relying on Munson's sign on Sunday. All right, and here we have bullous keratopathy. And nobody wants any of these conditions, but if I had to choose one that I would least like to have, it would probably be this one. We talked earlier about how the epithelium and the endothelium are the limiting membranes for the cornea. They control the fluid, movement of fluids and gases in and out. We also talked about the fact that the endothelium is a single layer of cells that does not regenerate. So if you lose endothelial cells, the other surrounding cells try and cover the defect. If you lose enough endothelial cells, it can no longer do a proper job of controlling the fluid that enters the cornea. And that's when you start to get into a bullous keratopathy. What happens is the cornea starts to absorb excessive fluid because the endothelium is not working right anymore. It gets to the point where the cells start to rupture, and when those eruptions reach the surface, they expose raw nerve endings, extremely painful. The good news is that by placing well, just step back for a second. If you think about it, if you've ever gone to the dentist and they're drilling around in there and they get pretty close to a nerve and then they spray air in there, you know how you come right out of the chair. Well, that's kind of what these people have. Those exposed nerve endings on the cornea with the atmosphere blowing on it is just incredibly painful. But the good news is we can place a therapeutic soft lens on there, and now we have a barrier between the the air blowing on there and the nerves, and they get instant relief. That's certainly a great application for a therapeutic contact lens. Every contact lens fitter's worst nightmare, though, is a corneal ulcer, because really it's a crapshoot. As long as the corneal epithelium is intact, it's almost impossible to get a corneal ulcer. The cells are tight, nothing gets in, and you've got the lysozyme killing off the bacteria, and so generally you're pretty safe. However, all it takes is one little break in the surface, and you've got a potential site for an infection. And there are lots of nasty bugs out there, many of them that are already present in your cornea that would just love to invade given the opportunity. Now, because when you're wearing a contact lens, you get debris underneath the contact lens, there's a higher likelihood that you could get a break. That's what raises your chance of developing a corneal ulcer as a contact lens wearer. And bacterial ulcers can be particularly nasty. Here's an example of a bacterial ulcer, and you can see how pus has filled the anterior chamber. That's known as a hypopyon. Of all the ulcers, this is the worst. This is a Pseudomonas ulcer. And this is a bacteria that's capable of destroying your eye within 24 hours. In this case here, this was a woman that had successfully worn extended wear soft contact lenses, I think from the time she was 16 until she was 23 or 24. What everybody would consider a successful wearer. She woke up one morning and the eye didn't feel right. It was red, but just chalked it up to too much fun the night before. Did nothing about it. Left the lens in, which was the worst thing you could do. Left the lens in for another 24 hours, and by that following morning, that was her eye. We talked just a minute ago about the soft contact lens being a barrier protecting the eye, but it also will take away your natural warning system. Generally, if you had an ulcer developing and the contact lens wasn't in there, you would be in so much pain you would rush to the emergency room. But in her case, because the soft lens was working like a bandage on the eye, she wasn't aware of the full extent of what was going on with her eye until it looked ridiculous the next day. If she had taken the lens out at the first sign of redness that first morning, she would have been in pain. She would have gone to the doctor. They would have treated it, and she probably would have saved her vision. But by not removing the lens, ignoring the symptoms, that's how she wound up like this. And that's why it's so critical when you're educating a patient that they're aware of the early warning signs of a potential ulcer. And if you tell them nothing else while dispensing contact lenses, you need to tell them, look, if you experience pain, redness, decreased vision, or increased light sensitivity, those are the big four. You must remove the lens and you must seek medical attention. It's a serious condition. Various viral ulcers. This one's called a geographic ulcer. You can see how it's spread across there. Some of the viral ulcers, just like viruses in general, are very difficult to treat. And sometimes the ophthalmologist will have to actually scrape off the epithelial cells and let them regrow as part of the treatment. Fungal ulcers can be pretty nasty too. And you can see particularly that lower left-hand one looks particularly nasty. Here's another little bug that gets a lot of attention in contact lens circles, and that's acanthamoeba. Now, an acanthamoeba, it's not a bacteria, it's not a virus, it's this little free-living protozoa that loves to survive. And you'll find that in all sorts of areas, particularly, lake water, tap water. You can even find it in unpreserved contact lens solutions. The problem is that if this bug gets into your eye, invades the cornea, it's very difficult to treat because if it encounters a harsh environment, it forms a cyst around itself, which is very resistant to treatment. So if you've ever had any patients come into your office with an acanthamoeba infection, they were probably referred to a corneal specialist, and long term they probably wound up with a corneal transplant. And of the cases of acanthamoeba that are seen, almost all of them are contact lens patients. So that's one of the reasons why, again, it goes back to our education of contact lens patients as to what they should and shouldn't do. And they should never swim with their contact lenses. And that's swimming in a lake, swimming in a pool, going in a hot tub, taking a shower. The lenses should simply not be in. It's not worth the risk. The FDA approves all contact lenses, and there's no lens that's approved for swimming. And this is what acanthamoeba. What's kind of weird is the white infiltrates start to have a ring-like appearance to them with an acanthamoeba infection. If there's a patient and they say, I'm a -5, I'm going to wear my lenses swimming anyways, I don't care what you say, at least try and get them into a disposable lens so they can get rid of the lens as soon as they get done with their swimming event. Okay, as I mentioned before, the cornea wants to survive. And if it's not getting enough oxygen, or if you're putting too much pressure on the limbal vessels, in some cases with injury or infection, you will get blood vessels that will pass that limbal area, will start to invade the cornea. And that's when we have new vessel growth or neovascularization. This is something that we really don't want to persist. You see even this slide here, if you look right at about 6 o'clock, there's a significant vessel invading. Now, it's not uncommon with a new contact lens patient to see a little engorgement in the limbal vessels. And usually that's okay. What you're concerned about is when the vessels start to invade and they start to divide. You see that, you got a serious problem, and you need to refit with something that's going to get a lot more oxygen to that eye. And if it's an existing wearer that comes in and they got vessels that are in more than 1 millimeter or so, I would consider taking them out of contact lenses. And here's a soft lens wearer. And you can see how far the vessels invaded. Clearly somebody that didn't come back for follow-up visits. It's a shame, because they should never ever wear a contact lens again. All right, so if there is a lack of oxygen, as we saw a little bit earlier, one of the things that happens is the cornea starts to swell. And that swelling or edema is visible in a couple different ways. With soft lens patients, because you're covering the entire cornea with the lens, the swelling tends to be a bit more uniform. As it swells toward the front, it starts to form wrinkles toward the back. And these wrinkles or folds in the deep stroma or Descemet's membrane are referred to as stria or striations, and they tend to have a vertical orientation. One of the things that we'll go through as we talk about using the slit lamp is how do you create the proper illumination to be able to see these folds in the deep stroma. With earlier generation hard lenses and with gas permeable lenses that don't get enough oxygen, it's a bit easier to see the effects because the effect only takes place under the optical zone of the contact lens. So we tend to have the edema localized right in the center of the cornea, and that tends to be referred to as central corneal clouding. In fact, if you have a long time contact lens patient, you look in their records, you may see when they had earlier generation materials that they had grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 CCC, which stood for central corneal clouding. All right, here is, when we talk about the slit lamp, we'll talk about a direct focal parallel pipette, or basically an illuminated block of corneal tissue. We're looking straight on, the beam's coming in at about a 45-degree angle. And if you look carefully at this picture, it's almost divided in half. The left-hand side is a little bit whiter in appearance, and that actually is showing you the front surface of the cornea. The right-hand side of the picture is a little lighter, and that's an illuminated block of corneal tissue. And if you look carefully, about the middle of that second block, you see a white line, a vertical line, and that's a vertical stria or striation. It's nothing there. It's an optical defect. If you were to dissect the cornea, it wouldn't be there. It's just because of the fold, it causes the light to reflect off the fold and make it visible. The more of those folds that we see, the greater the swelling of the cornea. Now here you can see we have a pretty good shot of central corneal clouding. And you can see that it's restricted to the area that was covered by the base curve of the contact lens. The remaining cornea remains pretty clear. Some more subtle things that will happen over a period of time. One of the things that you can see is little microcysts or little pockets of cellular debris, look like little water blisters inside the cornea that may occur with a long-term lack of oxygen. You also will start to see those changes in the endothelial cells that I talked about earlier. Again, if they're changing in size, that's polymegathism. If they're changing in shape, that's pleomorphism. A clear indication that that patient's not getting enough oxygen. Microcysts are hard to see. One of the now, if you look at this picture, you see that direct focal parallel pipette beam on the right, but that's not really where we're looking. We're looking at an area where the light is being reflected off the iris and illuminating the cornea from behind. And if you look carefully, just to the left-hand side of this beam, you'll see little dots in the pupil. And those are the microcysts. This illumination is referred to as retroillumination and is really the only way you can see a microcyst. And we'll talk about that more later. And here again is an example of an endothelium that has issues. And in this case, a wide range of sizes and shapes to those endothelial cells. Anytime you have a injury that goes beyond the epithelium, you're going to have a certain level of corneal scarring. And one of the things that we like to do is to try and classify how dense the opacity is. So if they've got a corneal scar, you want to note the size, density, and location on the patient's record. And we use 3 levels, and appears I have a little bit of an error in my slide here because it's actually a nebula that's a faint lack of transparency. A macula is translucent but well-defined, and a leucoma is the dense opacity. So if we look at this picture here, this is a reflection of the flash, the really bright white, but next to it you can see that there's probably no light getting through that. So that would be a leucoma. If we look at about 12 o'clock in the pupil, there's a faint lack of transparency. You can see there's something there. It would be hard to draw a line around it. That would be a nebula. Over here, it's a little more defined. I could draw a line around it. That would be a macula. So it's a subjective impression of how dense that opacity is. And the leukomas, the dense ones, you can see here, are pretty unsightly. In some cases, they go limbus to limbus. In these cases with leukoma, it's pretty unlikely that the patient has any usable vision out of that eye. And on top of it, they look pretty weird. So one of the applications for contact lenses is for people like this that have disfigured eyes where they're not seeing, but they don't look good. And fortunately today, we could fit this person with a opaque tinted contact lens, much like the lenses that are used to change eye color. But instead of having a clear pupil, it would have a black pupil and could give them a near normal appearance, which would be huge for a lot of these people. So just another application of where contact lenses can make a difference in somebody's life. You may see some patients come in like this. This is a person that's had radial keratotomy. This was the procedure that was used commonly prior to LASIK to alter the shape of the cornea. And they literally would make all these radial incisions to weaken or flatten the cornea to reduce the myopia. And it creates fitting problems that we'll talk a little bit on Sunday. Also causes vision problems. You can imagine what their vision is like at night when the pupil's dilated and they've got the light bouncing off of all these scars. Yeah, bad news. Cataracts. There's certainly nothing that we can do about cataracts, but sometimes when we're not getting a result that we want, and we got a little bit older patient, maybe part of it may be the development of a cataract. On the flip side, even though we don't typically fit as many contact lenses to aphakic patients anymore, most patients having intraocular lens implants, the one population where that typically doesn't happen is with babies at birth. And so there is still applications of contact lenses for congenital cataracts. And they present a huge problem because for those very small eyes, requires a very powerful lens. And it's hard to get enough oxygen through the lens to keep the eye healthy. Plus, you got to teach the parents how to deal with the lenses. So that's a whole pediatric aphakic lens fitting is a whole different specialty. Okay, time for another break. So I have, it's about 20 or 8:42. Let's go 5 minutes this time, and then we'll jump into the next. So we'll start again at 9:47. And again, unfortunately, I can't see your chats, but I think they're being monitored. So hopefully that's okay with everybody, and I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Yeah, 8:47, I think.
Okay, that works.
Okay.
Yeah, 9:47 would be pretty late, wouldn't it? That's. All right, thanks, Mark.
All right, sure. sure everybody's here. If you're still on the call, just raise your hand. Lucas, Cynthia, Deborah, James, Susan. I think all of them raised it at one time or another. So we're good. Let's go.
All right, great. Thanks, Mark.
Sure.
Okay, and so in this last session this evening, what we're going to do is start to talk about the instruments that you'll be using as part of the hands-on experience this weekend, and give you an idea of how we might use them and some of the capabilities. So we'll start out talking about the slit lamp. And, you know, hopefully all of you had a chance to use a slit lamp in some capacity in the past. But one of the problems that you can run into is that, particularly if, you know, if you're the only optician and you're in the office and the doctor's not terribly interested in letting you practice or work with a slit lamp, those are skills that can be difficult to learn. It takes a couple of things to get good with a slit lamp. First is to have a step-by-step procedure and understand the capabilities of the instrument. And the second part is practice. You know, unfortunately, you know, you'll look at an experienced slit lamp operator and they go zip, 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 and they're done. And you go, well, you know, how do they do that? You know, how can they tell what they're seeing? Well, it's practice. It's thousands of eyes. And, you know, initially you start working with the instrument and you're thinking, well, yeah, I think I found the eyeball and it's kind of in focus. But with practice, you're so used to seeing normal eyes that when something abnormal is there, it just jumps out at you. So it's really a skill that takes a lot of practice, but anybody can learn it. And, you know, here are the key things to getting better. One is a careful patient history. If you can take a detailed history, sometimes, particularly during follow-up visits, that will guide you to areas that you need to take a closer look at. Even a brand new patient, you know, a history of certain eye diseases and injuries can alert you to areas that you need to pay closer attention to. The other area that you need to understand is what can be created with the slit lamp, the different types of illumination. I mentioned a couple different types earlier. We're going to go through all the different types of illumination, but the slit lamp and all its illuminations are kind of like a toolbox. You know, and you may or may not have a toolbox, but if you do have a toolbox, you've probably got way more tools than you frequently use. And it's nice to have them, but most of the time you're using a screwdriver, maybe a crescent wrench, and some vice grips or something. So there's a few tools you use all the time. Or even in the dispensing lab, you know, maybe you use a padded plier for end pieces, you're using a nose adjusting plier, you're using a flat round. You got certain favorite tools that you use all the time, but then there's a few tools that are nice to have for special situations. And that's kind of the way some of these illuminations are with the slit lamp. You're not going to use them all the time, but for that special situation, they're critical. So once everybody has a clear understanding of the capabilities of the instrument, then I'll share a step-by-step procedure that I think works well. The nice part about it is that if you follow the step-by-step procedure every time, you're not going to miss anything. And initially, it's going to be a slow process. But as you become more comfortable with the instrument and following the procedure, your speed will develop. And then finally, getting into the habit of documenting what you see. You know, fortunately today, more and more offices are going to, you know, photo documentation, but you still need to be able to chart different conditions that you see. So what kind of things are you interested in surgery or in history? Well, certainly any surgery they've had to the eye, any injuries to the eye, particularly the cornea, any eye diseases that they're aware of, and even other systemic diseases that they may have, and certainly any medications that they may be taking. You know, if they're taking medications, you need to get a handle on what those medications are and look up and see if they have any ocular side effects, because there are some medications that will cause significant drying of the eye. Photo slit lamps make life a lot easier, and you know, fortunately, we've got a brand new one at the college that you'll get a chance to work with this weekend. And you know, just the capabilities of what you can see has improved dramatically over the years. The ability to capture digital images and to also capture video of actual eyes and contact lens fits make it great to explain to patients. In an educational setting, make it great to explain to the students. But really, when we're talking about a slit lamp, we're talking about illumination, and we're talking about magnification. So in its simplest form, you know, you could take a flashlight and a magnifier, and you've got the elements of a basic slit lamp. What really makes things different between just an illuminated magnifier and a slit lamp is our ability to see subtle changes, particularly in transparent structures. And the guy that figured out why we can see things better with a slit lamp was a guy named Tyndall. And what Tyndall discovered is that if you view a transparent structure against a black background, and you shine a beam of light in from a oblique angle, what will happen is as the light passes through that transparent structure, if there's any lack of transparency, if there's any little structures in there, they will reflect the light back into the observer eye and make them visible. And that's basically what we're doing with the slit lamp. And when it comes to the lid margins and the conjunctiva and those other areas, you know, if you had a powerful enough flashlight and magnifier, you could see the same thing. But when we get to the cornea or the anterior chamber, or even though we're not too interested in it, the crystalline lens, that's when Tyndall's phenomenon really shines, and it allows us to see very subtle changes in the transparency of particularly the cornea. So of the different types of illumination that we can set up, there's two main forms. One is referred to as direct, and by direct, what that means is that we're directly illuminating the area that we're observing. And the other is indirect, where we're offsetting the light source. But under the heading of direct, what's really changing is the width of the beam, and in some cases, the angle between the microscope and the light source. You know, a slit lamp is a lot like a projector. It's projecting a beam of light onto the eye. What's different is that we can control the width of the beam, we can control the height of the beam, we can control the intensity of the beam, and we can control the color of the beam. And through those manipulations, we can reveal different structures within the eye. Now with diffuse, as you can see in the picture here, the microscope is looking straight in the eye. And with diffuse, we're using a wide open beam. We're just literally flooding the eye with light. It's great for a general overall view. Some slit lamps even have an extra ground glass adapter that drops down in front of the light source that further diffuses the light. But you know, again, and I know this is very small print, but just to kind of keep me on track, with diffuse, you can observe a contact lens positioning and movement. You can use it to check the surface wettability of the cornea of a contact lens. It's this diffuse illumination that we would use for tear breakup time. And you recall that if there's a break in the surface of the cornea, it will absorb the fluorescein and stain it a bright green color. It's also good for watching their blink reflex. So, this is what we would love to see. A nice, healthy, clean-looking eye. You look at this. There's almost no injection in the conjunctiva. The cornea looks clean and wet. You can see a reflection off the lacrimal lake. That's what we like to see. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. But this is a good example of diffuse. We're looking straight on. Light beam's coming in at about a 45-degree angle and is wide open. Now here, we're still looking straight on. The beam's still coming in at 45 and it's wide open. The difference is that we have introduced what's known as a cobalt filter. And a cobalt filter is a dark blue filter that causes the fluorescein to turn the fluorescent green that you see in this picture. In this case here, we're observing a rigid contact lens on the cornea, and if you look at it carefully, you can see there's some pooling around the edge of the lens, and there's a whole concentration of fluorescein centrally. So this would be an example of a steep-fitting gas perm lens on a spherical cornea, because the appearance is the same in all meridians. We'll get into analyzing fluorescein patterns later in the weekend. Now here's a shot. We talked earlier about giant papillary conjunctivitis and how if you flip that lid and you want to highlight the appearance of the papillae, you can put a little fluorescein in there and use a cobalt filter, and this is what you see. Another example of a diffuse illumination. You can use it to look at blood vessels, look for signs of neovascularization. And the filter that will help you here is you can still use diffuse, but instead of using that cobalt filter, the blue filter, we use a green filter, which is also known as the red-free filter. And the green filter blocks any red so that any blood vessel that was red now appears black. So particularly if you have an amber-colored iris, it's kind of hard to see how far the blood vessels are penetrating. You throw that green filter in there and it really adds definition to each of those vessels. And remember, there's a lot of reasons that can cause neovascularization, but from a contact lens standpoint, it's the lack of oxygen or potentially a tight fit in the limbal area that can cause that problem to occur. All right, so beyond diffuse, we're going to go now to where we narrow the beam. And we can narrow it a couple different ways. We can narrow it down to a 1 to 2 millimeter, which gives us that illuminated block of corneal tissue called a parallel pipid. Or we can narrow it all the way down to a beam that's almost closed. It's an optic section. The parallel pipid is going to be good for staining, opacities, infiltrates, deposits on a contact lens. The optic section gives us a more cross-sectional view, so we can use that for seeing how deep an abrasion is, where an embedded foreign body might be, where an opacity is located. We can look for signs of thickening or thinning of the cornea. All right, so here's still direct, and again by direct, what that means is that the microscope, the light source is illuminating the area we're looking at with the microscope. In this case here, with a parallel pipid, this beam width would be 1 to 2 millimeters, still about a 45-degree angle. Or if we want to narrow it all the way down to where it's almost closed, we create an optic section, which gives us a true cross-sectional view of the cornea, just like we took a slice out of the cornea and turned it on its side. So here's a direct focal parallel pipid. This one here, we can see we got some corneal dystrophy going on. But we're looking straight out with the microscope. The beam's coming in at about a 45. And excuse me, in this case here, this first rectangle, which is much larger, shows the surface of the cornea. And then this narrower beam next to it is the illuminated block of tissue. We're also getting what is referred to as a retroillumination. The light's bouncing off the iris and illuminating these opacities from behind. Here's that same vertical stria that I showed you earlier. Again, we're looking straight on. This is a parallel pipette width beam. And where do we see that fold? We see it in the deeper part of the cornea. And that's where we would expect to find vertical stria, because there are folds either in the deep stroma or Descemet's membrane. Here's the optic section, and you can see that we've cut it down to just a cross-sectional view. This beam is probably only 0.5 millimeter wide, but we can see the full thickness from epithelium to endothelium with an optic section. Now, I mentioned that we can control the width of the beam and the height of the beam. If we narrow the width down to an optic section and the height down to about the same, we get a tiny dot of light called a conical beam. As opticians and contact lens fitters, that's not an illumination that we typically use. The doctors will use this illumination to detect disturbances in the anterior chamber. The picture we're looking at here is the conical beam hitting the cornea and hitting the crystalline lens. Front surface, back surface, and so forth. Right in between the numbers 3 and 4 and here, you can detect a haze. And what that is that's an increase in white blood cells floating in the anterior chamber, an indication there's some sort of interocular infection or inflammation. But again, this is not something that we typically would use as contact lens fitters. Another illumination that's direct, but a little different setup, is called specular reflection. Now in this diagram, they're showing the light, the microscope at 45 and this at 45. You can actually move this a little bit. You can keep the microscope straight on and just move this back and forth until the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. And when that happens, in the beam, here's the parallel pipette beam over here in this drawing, you'll see a bright, dazzling reflection. That bright reflection you can use to look at how smooth the tear film is, how much debris is in it. But typically, what we want to do is we want to use specular reflection to look at the endothelium, that single layer of hexagonal cells at the back of the cornea. So once we find the bright reflection, we move our focus a little bit to focus on the duller image just to the right of it. And that's where, under high magnification, we can see the endothelial cell pattern, looking for signs of polymegathism and pleomorphism. All right, now here's a typical parallel pipette. 1, 2, and 3 would be where it's hitting the front surface. From E to F and D to H, that's the illuminated block of corneal tissue. This one here, same parallel pipette, but now we're focused in at 5, 6, 7, and 8. And that's the kind of depth of focus that we would go for if we had the specular reflection going on. The bright reflection here, this would be the duller image. This would be where we'd see the endothelial cells. Here's an example. Here's the bright reflection, but we're not really looking at that. We've moved on. We're focused on the duller image, and you can see the pattern of the cells. All right, so that's some examples of direct illumination. Now for indirect, we have to intentionally decide to create indirect. We have to physically turn the light source away from the area being observed by the microscope. If we do that while we're looking at an opaque structure, like the conjunctiva or the cornea, then that's referred to as proximal or indirect illumination. We're illuminating the area in proximity to the area we're observing. And typically where we'd use that would be for looking at something like a pinguecula or maybe a pterygium, for example, where if you shine it directly on there, you get such a bright reflection, it sort of obscures what you're trying to see. By moving it a little off center, you still have enough light to see it, but you're not washing it out. If we move that indirect over onto the cornea, then we're creating a retroillumination. We're redirecting the beam so it goes deeper in the eye, bounces off the iris, and illuminates the cornea from behind. If we look directly in the reflected path, then that's referred to as direct retro. If we look to one side or the other of the reflected beam, then that's referred to as indirect retro. All right, so pinguecula like this is diffuse illumination, but if we narrowed it down, we would get a bright reflection. So we rotate the beam so it's a little off center, and it gives us a better appreciation of the color and the elevation. Again, on the cornea, instead of looking, here's the beam here, now we're turning it off center, and we're illuminating the area it's going in. It's hitting the iris, it's illuminating it from behind. Here's an example of direct retro. All right, we've rotated the beam. The beam hits the iris, the light bounces back, and we're observing directly in the line with that reflected light. We might do this if we wanted to see how opaque something was. This is a great way to look at deposits on a contact lens to see if they're really opaque or kind of translucent. Indirect retro means that you're redirecting, it's bouncing off the iris, but you're looking a little bit off center from where the beam is passing through. And this is how you would look for things like microcysts that I showed you earlier. Another illumination that I think is very helpful, I like to use it as my initial screening illumination when I look at the cornea, is sclerotic scatter. And for this, you can either turn the light or you can simply move the light, but the light has to hit the temporal limbus. This is the one illumination where you really don't even need the microscope. You can just swing that out of the way. And what happens is when you hit it right on the temporal limbus, the light bounces back and forth, just like fiber optics, between the epithelium and the endothelium, all the way across to the other side, actually all the way around in all directions. And what happens is if something blocks the path of the light, some small opacity, it will reflect the light back into your eye, making it visible. So for picking up big opacities, significant edema, and things like that, sclerotic scatter can be very helpful. And here's an example here where we hit the limbus, we've got a circumcorneal halo that tells we've got to set up right, and we not only can pick up something on the contact lens, a little bubble right here, but we can also see this gray patch, which would be an example of central corneal clouding. Okay, and here's an even more visible one. Again, sclerotic scatter, but look at all the deposits on this rigid contact lens. Okay, so now we know the capabilities, we know the types of illumination. Now what we're going to get into is a step-by-step procedure. And this will be a procedure that we'll be working through this weekend as well. And if you get the habit and you understand the procedure, the goal is so that you can go back to your office and practice some of these procedures and get better at it. And I think this may help you. So even though you may have your own little routine that you use now for using the slit lamp, try this. And some of it's the same as I'm sure what you're doing, but other things in here might make it a little bit easier to pick up some of these conditions. First step, like any other optical instrument, is to focus the eyepieces and adjust the interpupillary distance. To focus the eyepieces, there is a focusing rod that goes right into that center of common rotation. Every slit lamp comes with one. However, in some offices, if it's one person that's been using the slit lamp all along, they may have misplaced it. And if that's the case, it's worth taking a little time and creating your own focusing rod. Whether you got to use a straw, a wooden dowel, or something that'll fit in there, and just use a Sharpie to make it black, and you can use that to focus your eyepieces, and I think you'll find it easier to pick up subtle changes. From there, you wipe down the headrest and chin rest with alcohol, position the patient, and adjust their head position. We want to make sure that their outer canthus aligns with the black mark that's on the headrest of the the headrest here. To adjust the chin rest, there's typically a knob down where her hands would be that are out of the picture. We want to start with the lowest magnification in most cases. Now, in some cases, there might be a really low magnification, like a 10, which is probably a little too low, but most are 16, 25, and 40. If you happen to have a 10, 16, and 25, use the 16 as your low magnification. And you might think, well, why don't we crank it right up? Well, the problem is that the higher the magnification, the smaller your field of view, and the easier it is to get lost when you're doing the exam. So start out with a lower magnification, you get a wider field of view, and if you see something that looks a little out of the ordinary, you can always crank it up. You also want to start with the microscope straight on the eye and the illumination system at about a 45-degree angle. You also want to move the whole base over so that when you turn the beam on, you're on the outer canthus in that area. The last thing you want to do is blast them in the pupil. The goal with a good pre-fit exam in particular is to check out everything but the cornea first without getting light into the pupil, and only put in the pupil when you have to. Because what's going to happen when you hit that person in the pupil with the light, you're going to stimulate a lot of reflex tearing, which may invalidate some of your other observations. So here's a typical slit lamp. So this adjusts the chin rest on this knob right here. You've got a beams for controlling the width of the beam, the height of the beam, and a joystick for moving the instrument in and out, left and right. Intensity-wise, some slit lamps have a rheostat, some have a low, medium, and high. Keep it down on low. Keep it as comfortable as you can for the patient. Now, if you're using a filter and you need to adjust the intensity a little bit, fine. But for most observations, the low intensity will work as well, as will a medium width beam. Again, it's kind of like you start out with the standard setup. You can always switch to one of those other tools if you need it. We're going to go in a kind of a circle. We're going to start out by looking at the lower lid margin, and then we're going to go to the upper lid margin. One of the things to keep in mind as you're using the instrument, anytime you're looking at something from the midpoint of the eye toward the ear, the light source should be at a 45-degree angle coming in from the ear side. Anytime you're looking from the midpoint of the eye toward the nose, the light source should be toward the nose, again forming about that 45-degree angle. And I'll demonstrate all these steps on Friday anyways. But again, we're going to start out with the lid margins. And again, 1 to 2 millimeter width beam. As we go across, we're going to lower the beam so that we're not getting into the pupil. You can have the patient look up. You're going to sweep along. When you get to the midpoint, move the light source to the nasal side. Continue your sweep. And what kind of things do we expect to see? Well, we talked earlier that things can happen to the lid margin. Ectropion, where the lid margin rolls out. Entropion, where the lid margin rolls in. Trichiasis, where the lashes, some of them curl toward the eye. Chalazion, a bump caused by a blockage in the meibomian gland. Hordeolums or styes, where there's an infection with the glands that lubricates your eyelashes typically. You can observe the lacrimal lake. You then, blepharitis would be apparent as you were sweeping those margins. Again, different examples of chalazions. Sometimes chalazions are visible from the outside better, sometimes from the inside. Again, the hordeolum or stye, you're going to see more redness. It's an infection. It's going to look more like a pimple. Ectropion, that lid margin just rolls out. Entropion, the lid margin curls in along with all the lashes. You're probably going to see lashes laying against the eye. Trichiasis is probably just a few lashes that are curling in. You're then going to raise the beam up, come back across the upper lid margin, looking for exactly the same things. Again, as you get to the midpoint, move your light source back over to the temporal side. All right, from there, you're going to have the patient look up, take your thumb, and pull the lower lid down so you can look at both the lower palpebral conjunctiva and the lower bulbar conjunctiva as you make that sweep. So they look up, you pull the lower lid down, and as you're sweeping, again, midpoint, light source goes back over to the other side. Okay, and the kind of things that you would look for is injection, where the blood vessels are dilated larger than they normally would be. A hemorrhage where one of the vessels is ruptured, conjunctivitis, which again could be bacterial, viral, allergic, any conjunctival cyst, or any nevi that you might see. All right, then you're going to reach around, get underneath their upper lashes, pull their upper lid up, have them look down. And this time we're not trying to see the upper palpebral conjunctiva. You have to flip the lid for that. We're just going to look at the upper bulbar and the upper limbal area. We will get to the upper palpebral at the end because flipping the lid is another activity that will stimulate reflex tearing. All right. Now, to check out the nasal bulbar conjunctiva, have them look toward their ear, sweep over, and this is where you might see pinguecula, pterygium, limbal injection, might be a nevus. All right, again, they're looking down, you pull the upper lid up, they look down, we come across the upper bulbar, injection, limbal injection, nevi. Notice we always swing the light source back over to the other side. All right, so we've done a circle. We did the lower palpebral and bulbar, the nasal bulbar, the upper bulbar. Now we need to do the temporal bulbar. So they look toward their nose. We sweep for the same things we were looking for on the nasal side. Okay, so now we have looked at everything except the cornea. So on the conjunctiva, what were we looking for? Well, we might see on the palpebral injection, conjunctivitis. Concretions are little minute yellow, hard things you'll see typically in elderly patients. You might see cysts, papillae. On the bulbar, the pingueculas, the cysts, the pterygiums. So here's some examples of signs of conjunctivitis. The ever lovely looking bacterial conjunctivitis, conjunctival cyst, pingueculas, nevi, hemorrhages. If they had a dry eye, we put rose Bengal in, we would see some staining at 3 and 9 o'clock, pterygium. And now we're ready for the last part of the typical pre-fit exam, which would be to examine the cornea. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the illumination that I like to use for pre-fit evaluation is sclerotic scatter. And with that, what we're going to do is we don't really need to use the microscope. We just moderate width beam, coming in at about a 45, bring it over until it hits the temporal limbus, and when we get it set up properly, we will see a circumcorneal halo or glow all the way around the cornea. And at that point in time, we're just going to lean in and look if there's any corneal edema or opacities. If they're wearing a contact lens, we'll also be able to see some lens deposits or defects. Okay. Here's an example, sclerotic scatter with central corneal clouding. Here's some scars. All right, and then for our final sweep and observation, we're going to go ahead and do a detailed sweep of the cornea using a direct focal parallel pipette beam. Again, the microscope is straight on. The light source is coming in about 1 to 2 millimeter wide, coming in at about a 45. And when we get to the midpoint, go to the other side. And what we're looking for is we can observe the tear film, how much debris is in it, how clean does it look, is there any scars, if there's fluorescein in there, any abrasions, if it's a soft lens patient, maybe we're looking for vertical stria for edema, any signs of neovascularization. Again, central corneal clouding, yeah, we don't want to see that. Here's a corneal abrasion on the image on the left, and you can see how clearly you can see that with a direct focal illumination, little red arrow pointing to it. Here's the vertical stria again, which is deeper in our illuminated block of corneal tissue. Neovascularization, if we see something, we probably want to throw that red-free filter in, the green filter, to highlight the blood vessels. Another one here, you can see this vessel. These vessels are right at about 12 o'clock. Particularly with gas perm patients, if it's a follow-up visit, you want to make sure you push the lid up and look at 12 o'clock, because that's where you're most likely to see things like neovascularization. If the patient has been out in a dry, dusty environment and there's things flying around, they may come in, you put fluorescein, and all of a sudden you see these wild, swirly patterns on the cornea. These are extremely superficial, caused by dust particles. If you put fluorescein in this patient, in probably a half hour, those would be gone. But it does point out why anybody that gets contact lenses should also have a pair of sunglasses to wear outside, particularly on windy days. I mentioned that any break in the surface, any corneal abrasion, will stain with fluorescein. As you become more proficient with the slit lamp, you'll be able to identify areas where there's abrasions even without putting fluorescein in there. But fluorescein will stain any area where there's a break in the surface. If you have a dry eye that gets bad enough, they'll start to show some staining as well. Here's an interesting one here. You can see that the bright green is around 6 o'clock. This was a soft lens patient that didn't slide the lens down far enough when they flexed it out of their eye. They would just reach out and pinch the contact lens, and as they did that, they would scrape off epithelial cells, leaving this kind of abrasion. Tear breakup time. With experience, you'll see that if the cornea doesn't look shiny and wet, there's probably a problem. Again, looking for staining. You can see changes with an optic section to the shape of the cornea, like we can see here with the keratoconus. Here's retroillumination, picking up some microcysts just to the left-hand side of the pupil. Here's specular reflection, looking for the appearance of the endothelial cells. So after you've done all this, you record your findings, and if based on the history, there are previous contact lens wear, you want to take a look at that upper palpebral conjunctiva, then you would go ahead and flip the lid and take a look at that. And that's pretty much the step-by-step procedure for a pre-fit evaluation. And again, I'll demonstrate that on Friday so that everybody's clear on what I just went over. Hopefully you don't see that, which would be an example of giant papillary conjunctivitis. And again, we can highlight that with a little fluorescein and a cobalt filter. Okay, and I think we have pretty much covered it for this evening. On Friday, I'll talk a little bit about measuring the corneal curvature, and then we'll jump right into some hands-on activities so you can use some of these instruments. But we got a couple minutes left. I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have about what we covered tonight or what we're going to cover this weekend or any other of the logistics questions that you might have. And Mark, maybe you can kind of mediate that for me.
Would be, let me sure. Would be happy to. Thank you. Let's see if there's any particular questions that anybody has. Deborah says, thank you very much.
Well, thank everybody for attending. It's nice to be able to cover some of this material in advance so you can think about it for a few days, and also you'll appreciate it on Sunday when you get out earlier.
Yeah. A couple of things I did remind that is on the HCC campus. Is the campus map showing up there, Bill?
Yes, it is. Yep, looks great.
Okay. So this is where the building, this is where you're going. Like I said, there's eyewear in there. You'll come off of Dale Maybury. Over here, you can't miss it. Big Raymond, is it Raymond James?
Raymond James Stadium, where the Buccaneers play. Yeah.
Right. You can't miss it. And you just pull in and park out in front of the building here.
Well, actually, there's no parking right where your arrow is. It's to the left.
Okay, that's right.
Lot 2.
Yeah, that's the parking lot. Yeah, that's right. That's the sidewalk, so that would be a problem. But you can park over in this area.
Yeah, either lot 2 or lot 1 on the right should be available.
Great. So we'll see you on Friday. So what time was it starting? 3 o'clock?
It starts at 3, so if you can get there around 5 and just so we can get you checked in and get settled in. Again, we'll be in the 2nd floor, same side as the elevators in room 206.
Yep. On Saturday, will the cafeteria be open for food?
I don't know. I don't think so. In which case, you may have to run out and there's a number of fast food type establishments near the campus.
Great. So it's all available. Near there, you'll be given plenty of time for break. And then on Sunday, you will have you'll break right at noon. So you don't need to pack a lunch that day. So we'll talk to you all on Friday. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call here at the POF office. Thanks. Really appreciate your time tonight, and see you on Friday. Bye now.
Great. See you on Friday. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Good night.